Welcome back to Dark Domain. Tonight we're diving into the deep, the hidden, and the dangerous. Get ready for 3 stories that will make you question what lies beneath the surface of the ordinary. Before we start, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe if you dare, and let us know in the comments, what's the strangest place you've ever felt like you weren't alone? Let's get started. The sleeping fields. I never liked working nights, but in Billings, Montana, when the winters stretch long and the days are short, the night shift at the local precinct is often the only shift to cover everything. Most nights it's quiet, just a drunk or two, maybe a domestic disturbance. Nothing out of the ordinary. That was until last week when the first body showed up. It was the middle of the night, sometime around 2 a.m. when the call came in. A jogger had found a body near the old grain silos on the edge of town. I was the closest to the area, so I grabbed my coat, threw on my badge, and headed out. In a town like Billings, bodies don't just show up. People around here keep to themselves, mind their business. It was unsettling from the start. The grain silos have always been eerie. The locals avoid them, said they were haunted or cursed or whatever excuse people use to keep their distance. They hadn't been used in years. When I pulled up, the wind was whipping through the empty fields, the silos looming in the darkness like forgotten sentinels. The body was lying near the base of one of them, a teenage boy, about 16 or 17. His face was peaceful, almost as if he were asleep, but his skin was pale and his lips were blue. No visible wounds, no signs of struggle, just a lifeless boy in the middle of nowhere. As I crouched down to examine him, a shiver ran down my spine. Something felt wrong. It wasn't just the body or the cold night air. It was the silence. There were no animals, no sounds, nothing. Just the wind and the dead boy at my feet. I called it in and waited for the coroner. As I stood there, trying to make sense of what I was looking at, I noticed something odd, a small patch of dirt beside the body. It was smooth, as if it had been recently disturbed, and in the middle of it was a single small toy, a plastic army man. The figure was old, worn, like it had been buried for a long time. I pocketed the toy, my mind already racing. Whoever left the boy here wasn't sloppy. They didn't leave a trail. But why the toy? The next day, the autopsy came back. No drugs, no signs of violence, no cause of death. The coroner chalked it up to natural causes, but that didn't sit right with me. A healthy teenage boy doesn't just drop dead in the middle of the night by an abandoned grain silo. Something was off. I kept thinking about that toy soldier. It was old, like something from the 60s or 70s. And the smooth patch of dirt, it wasn't random. Someone had buried it there deliberately. I started looking into missing persons cases, focusing on kids. And soon enough, I found something that chilled me to the bone. 40 years ago, in 1979, a boy named Tommy Grant disappeared from a small town a few miles outside of Billings. He was never found, but what stood out was the detail in the old case file. When Tommy went missing, he had been carrying a toy soldier. His mother had mentioned it in the report, a small piece of plastic he never went anywhere without. I felt the toy in my pocket, and a cold realization hit me. This wasn't a coincidence. Over the next few days, I dug deeper, looking into other unsolved cases. Kids who had gone missing over the years, their bodies never found, all from small towns around Billings. And in almost every case, there was a mention of something. A toy, a piece of clothing, something personal that tied each child to their disappearance. It wasn't until I revisited the grain silo that everything fell into place. The area was quiet again, the same eerie silence hanging in the air. But this time, I wasn't alone. A man was standing by the silo, his back to me, his hands buried in the pockets of a long coat. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and he stood perfectly still, staring out at the empty fields. "Can I help you?" I called out, approaching cautiously. He turned slowly, his face hidden in shadow under the brim of his hat. "I've been waiting for you," he said, his voice low and calm. I stopped, my hand instinctively moving toward my sidearm. "You know something about the boy?" I asked, keeping my tone even. He smiled, a cold, thin smile. "They're all here, you know. All the ones who went missing." I froze. "What are you talking about?" The man gestured to the silos, his eyes gleaming in the fading light. "They sleep beneath the earth. The fields keep them safe." I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "What do you mean?" He took a step closer, his smile never wavering. "I put them there. I keep them hidden. They belong to the land now." My blood ran cold. "You're saying you're responsible for the disappearances?" The man nodded, his eyes locked on mine. "They're not dead, officer. They're waiting." I didn't wait to hear anymore. I drew my gun, my pulse racing. "Get on the ground." But before I could react, he moved faster than I could have imagined. One moment he was standing there, and the next, he was gone, disappeared into the shadows, as if he'd never been there at all. I searched the area, calling for backup, but there was no trace of him. It was as if he had vanished into thin air, leaving me standing alone by the silos with nothing but the wind for company. The police searched the fields for days, bringing in cadaver dogs, forensic teams, the works. They found nothing, no bodies, no evidence, no sign that anything had been buried there. It was like the man had said. They were hidden, waiting beneath the earth where no one could reach them. I turned in the toy soldier to evidence, but it didn't matter. The case went cold, and the disappearances were chalked up to another mystery no one could solve. But I know what I saw. I know what's out there, under the fields, beneath the silos. And I know that somewhere, the man is still out there too, waiting for his next victim, ready to bury another child beneath the dirt where no one will ever find them. The shadows of Chicago's underworld. My name is Alex Martinez, and until recently, I was a freelance journalist based in Chicago. I specialized in uncovering hidden stories, the kind that lurk beneath the surface of everyday life. Last summer, I stumbled upon something that made me question everything I thought I knew about this city, a discovery that still haunts me. It all began when I received an anonymous tip about unusual activities happening in the old warehouses along the Chicago River's industrial corridor. The email was brief. "If you want a real story, check out the docks at night. Beware of the shadows." Intrigued, I decided to investigate. On a humid July evening, I drove to the desolate area near South Ashland Avenue. The streets were eerily quiet, illuminated only by the dim glow of sporadic streetlights. Parking my car behind an abandoned building, I made my way toward the docks with my camera and notebook in hand. As I approached, I noticed a group of unmarked vans parked near a warehouse. Men in dark clothing were unloading large, unidentifiable crates. They moved with brisk efficiency, speaking in hushed tones. From a concealed spot behind some stacked pallets, I began taking photos. Suddenly, a hand clamped down on my shoulder. I spun around to face a stern-looking security guard. "This is private property," he said gruffly. "You need to leave." "Sorry, I must have gotten lost," I replied, trying to sound casual. He didn't budge. "Now?" I nodded and retreated to my car, but from a distance, I continued to watch. The men finished unloading and disappeared into the warehouse. Something about the operation felt off. Why all the secrecy for a simple delivery? Over the next few days, I dug into property records and business licenses, but found nothing linking the warehouse to any legitimate company. It was as if the place didn't officially exist. Determined to uncover the truth, I returned the following night. This time, I equipped myself with a telephoto lens and positioned myself on the rooftop of a nearby building. Around midnight, the vans returned. The men unloaded more crates, but now I could see them transferring the contents into smaller packages, some containing weapons, others filled with what looked like bags of pills. My heart raced. I realized I was witnessing an organized crime operation, possibly arms and drug trafficking. I snapped as many photos as I could, documenting every detail. The next morning, I contacted Detective Lisa Thompson, an old acquaintance from previous stories. I shared my findings, and she agreed to meet discreetly. "Do you have any idea how dangerous this is?" she asked after reviewing the photos at a quiet cafe on the north side. "I figured the authorities would want to know," I replied. She sighed. "You've stumbled onto something big. We've been tracking a syndicate that's been evading us for months. This could be the breakthrough we need." Feeling a mix of fear and excitement, I agreed to cooperate. She advised me to lay low and avoid returning to the docks. A week later, news broke of a police raid on the warehouse. Several arrests were made, and a significant cache of illegal arms and narcotics was seized. I felt a sense of accomplishment, knowing I'd played a part. However, my relief was short-lived. 2 days after the raid, I noticed a black SUV trailing me as I drove home. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, but when it showed up outside my apartment that night, unease settled in. The following morning, a thick envelope was slid under my door. Inside were printed photos of me, captured while I was grocery shopping, walking in my neighborhood, even meeting with Detective Thompson. There was also a note: "Stay out of matters that don't concern you." I immediately called Lisa. "I think they know it was me," I whispered, my voice shaky. "Meet me at the precinct," she said. At the police station, I was placed under protective custody. "We underestimated their reach," Lisa admitted. "They have connections everywhere, but don't worry, we'll keep you safe." That night, I stayed at a hotel under an alias, courtesy of the police. Sleep eluded me as I grappled with anxiety and regret. Had I put myself, and others, in danger? Around 2 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You can't hide forever." Panic surged through me. How did they get this number? I alerted the officers stationed outside my room. They assured me the area was secure. The next morning, news broke that Detective Thompson had been found unconscious in her home, the victim of an apparent assault. She was in critical condition. Devastated, I realized the situation was spiraling out of control. The police decided to relocate me out of state until further notice. I was sent to a small town in Wisconsin, a stark contrast to the hustle of Chicago. Isolated and constantly looking over my shoulder, I felt trapped. One evening, I ventured into town to grab dinner. As I left the restaurant, I caught a glimpse of a familiar black SUV reflected in the window. My blood ran cold. Back at my temporary residence, I found the front door ajar. Cautiously entering, I saw that the place had been ransacked. Taped to the wall was another note: "Last warning." I knew then that nowhere was safe. Desperate, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I contacted a trusted editor at a major newspaper, someone with the influence to bring this story to light on a national level. We arranged a secure meeting. I handed over all my evidence, including new information I'd uncovered about corruption within certain law enforcement agencies, explaining how the syndicate always seemed one step ahead. The story hit the front page nationwide. The public outcry was immense. Federal agencies got involved, and a massive investigation was launched, leading to numerous arrests, including high-ranking officials who had been aiding the criminal network. For a moment, I felt vindicated, but the victory was bittersweet. I couldn't return to my old life. The threat against me was still real. The syndicate might have been crippled, but not entirely dismantled. I entered a witness protection program, receiving a new identity and relocating to a different part of the country. I became someone else, leaving behind my career, my friends, and the city I loved. It's been a year now. I still look over my shoulder, haunted by the shadows of Chicago's underworld. I share my story not for sympathy, but as a cautionary tale. In pursuing the truth, I underestimated the darkness that thrives in the hidden corners of our society. While I believe in the power of journalism and the importance of accountability, I also recognize the peril that can come with unearthing secrets some are willing to kill to protect. If you ever find yourself drawn into the depths of something dangerous, weigh your choices carefully. The line between heroism and self-destruction is thinner than you might think. I hope that by telling my story anonymously, others will be more vigilant. Stay safe, and remember that some shadows are cast by those who prefer to remain unseen. The sound below. My name is Jack, and this is the story of how I came to fear water. I was never afraid of it before. I grew up in Seattle, surrounded by rain, lakes, and the Pacific. I'd been a commercial diver for years, working jobs up and down the coast, helping maintain underwater pipelines, inspecting bridges, whatever paid the bills. But that was before the job in Clearfield, Utah. Clearfield isn't the kind of place you'd expect to find someone like me. No ocean, no major bodies of water, just a small town with a lot of government facilities. I got called in to inspect some abandoned structures left over from a Cold War-era project near the Great Salt Lake. Most of the details were vague, and no one wanted to explain much over the phone, but they offered double my usual rate. I wasn't in a position to say no. When I arrived, I met up with a team from a nearby military base. They told me they were looking for some leaks in old underground water storage tanks that had been built for reasons no one really seemed to remember. The paperwork was classified, and I wasn't asking questions. The tanks were massive, deep beneath the surface, reinforced concrete built to last centuries. My job was simple: go down, check for structural damage, and report back. But from the moment I arrived at the site, something felt wrong. The tanks were located in a desolate area near the lake, surrounded by salt flats and skeletal remains of long-abandoned buildings. The air was dry, the wind carrying the smell of salt and decay. The facility was silent, except for the occasional whistle of the wind through the broken windows of the control tower. I was the only diver on the job, which wasn't unusual, but the isolation got to me. The crew topside barely spoke, and they didn't seem eager to hang around. They got me into my suit, briefed me quickly, and sent me down. The water in the tanks was stagnant, black as night, and freezing cold. Even with my suit on, I could feel the chill creep into my bones. My flashlight barely penetrated the murky water, illuminating only a few feet ahead. As I descended deeper, the pressure around me increased, and so did the sense of something watching. I shook it off, focusing on the job. I found some cracks in the concrete, nothing major, and started marking them for repair. But then, I heard it. A sound, faint at first, barely audible through the thick water. It wasn't the usual creaks or groans of a structure under pressure. No, this was something else. It was rhythmic, like a pulse, deep and low, echoing through the water around me. I stopped, listening, trying to locate the source. It seemed to be coming from below. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. I followed the sound down, descending deeper into the tank than I had planned. The pulse grew louder, reverberating through the water and into my skull. My head ached, but I kept going, driven by some strange compulsion. The bottom of the tank was coated in silt, undisturbed for decades, but something was down there, something large and metallic, buried beneath layers of grime. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement in the silt, like something shifting beneath it. I radioed to the surface, asking if they knew what was down there. Static. I tried again, but all I got was garbled noise, like the signal couldn't penetrate the depth. Or maybe something was interfering with it. That's when the pulse changed. It became erratic, faster, almost frantic. I felt it in my chest, in my teeth, like it was trying to get inside me. Panic set in, and I started to ascend, but something caught my foot. I looked down and saw a cable, old and rusted, snaking out of the silt and wrapping around my ankle. I kicked, trying to free myself, but the cable held tight, dragging me down. My heart raced as I fought against it, pulling at the cable, but the harder I struggled, the tighter it became. My flashlight slipped from my hand and fell into the silt, plunging me into darkness. The pulse was deafening now, pounding inside my head, drowning out every thought except one. Something is here with me. I don't know how I managed to free myself, but eventually the cable loosened, and I kicked toward the surface, desperate for air. The ascent felt like it took hours, my lungs burning, my vision swimming. When I finally breached the surface, gasping for breath, I was alone. The crew was gone. The equipment, the trucks, everything was gone. The only sound was the wind howling through the empty facility. I climbed out of the tank, shivering, my suit dripping with freezing water, and staggered toward the control tower, but the doors were locked. No lights, no power. I was stranded. I tried my radio again, but all I heard was static. No one was answering. I spent hours pacing the facility, trying to find a way to contact someone, anyone, but there was nothing, just silence. That night, I camped out in the control tower, watching the tanks from the broken window. The pulse was still there, faint but constant, vibrating through the ground. I couldn't stop hearing it. When the sun rose, a military truck finally showed up. A new crew. No explanation. They didn't say much, just packed me into the truck and drove me back to town. I asked them about the others, the team that had left me behind. They said no one else had been out there, that I had been the only one on the job. I quit diving after that, sold all my gear, moved as far from the water as I could. But the pulse hasn't stopped. Sometimes late at night I can still hear it. Faint, but there. And I know it's waiting for me to come back. Thanks for tuning in to Dark Domain. If tonight's stories kept you on edge, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more chilling tales. And don't forget, we want to hear from you. What's the strangest place you've ever felt like you weren't alone? Drop it in the comments below. Until next time, stay vigilant. You never know what's out there waiting.